The day started like any other, but it wasn't. I remember the sky being a sickly gray, the kind that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I was on the set of The Trouble with Girls, a film that was supposed to be my comeback. But it wasn't just a film set. It was a circus, a mess, a collection of lost souls and broken dreams, and then the murder happened. I was playing the role of a young man who joins a traveling Chautauqua, a kind of old-timey variety show. The cast was huge, and everyone seemed to be acting their fool heads off, but it was all part of the job. The director, Phil Carlson, was trying to capture the spirit of the 1920s, but the songs we were singing didn't quite fit the era. They were more like modern pop tunes, and that made the whole thing feel a bit off. Film was supposed to be light and fun, a charming comedy with a murder thrown in for some excitement, but something went wrong. The script was all over the place, and the editing was a disaster. Scenes were cut, and the narrative drive got lost. It felt like the movie was being chopped up and reshaped even as we were filming it. I remember thinking that this wasn't going to be the comeback I hoped for. Despite all the chaos, there were moments that shone through. When I sang Almost, it felt like I was pouring my heart out. The song was so beautiful, and it was one of those rare times when I felt truly connected to the material. The director, Peter Tewksbury, captured it all with a camera that seemed to dance along with the music. The opening scenes, with the Chautauqua setting up in a small town, were especially vibrant. The crowd of extras, all dressed in period costumes, made it feel like we were really there in another time. But then the murder. It was supposed to be a plot twist, a way to keep the audience engaged, but it felt forced, like a cheap trick. The killer was never really caught, and the story just sort of fizzled out. It was as if the film itself didn't know what it wanted to be. The songs were another story. Clean Up Your Own Backyard was a standout. It was a protest song, a call to action, and it felt like something from the heart. The lyrics were sharp and the melody was catchy. It was one of those songs that could have been a hit if the film hadn't been such a mess. I remember singing it with a mix of anger and hope, and the band behind me was on fire. We all knew it was special, even if the rest of the film wasn't. There were other songs too, like Swing Down Sweet Chariot and Violet, but they were more like background noise. Almost was the only other song that really stuck with me. It was a ballad, a slow, soulful tune that made me think of my own past. The arrangement was a bit overdone, but the raw emotion in the recording was undeniable. I poured everything I had into it, and it showed. The film was released, and the reviews were mixed. Some critics, like Roger Greenspun, saw the potential and praised the ambition, but most were disappointed. They called it below par, and said it strained credibility. I could understand their frustration. The film was a jumbled mess, and it didn't do justice to the hard work we put in. But there were moments, fleeting moments, that made it all worth it. The Chautauqua, the songs, the feeling of being part of something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, those moments would be enough to keep me going, to keep me believing that I could still make a difference. I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and frustration as I listened to the tracks from the January and February 1969 sessions. From a Jack to a King was a fun, playful tune, but it just didn't have the same energy as the other songs. The female voices added a bit of a distraction, and it felt like Elvis wasn't really giving it his all. It was almost like he was just having a good time, which is cool, but it didn't match up with the intensity of the rest of the album. Then there was Hey Jude. Man, this one was a mess. It was held back for a few years before it was finally released in 1972. Some people say it was just an informal jam, but it was released as a finished track during Elvis's lifetime. That means it should be judged like any other song he put out. The biggest problem was that Elvis didn't know the words, and he hit some bum notes in every verse. It was like he didn't care much about the song, and it felt disrespectful to the fans who were buying his music. But hey, Elvis did have a soft spot for the song, and he even played it in his shows later on. There's a better version on the Memphis Sessions CD, but for the most part, it's just not one of his best. The next night, things picked up with Without Love. This was a powerful ballad from 1956, and Elvis really brought a gospel feel to it. It was different from his later ballads, which sometimes felt a bit overdone. This one was more stripped down and genuine, I'll Hold You in My Heart was incredible. Elvis sang this old country song with so much emotion, and it never felt forced. It was like he was pouring his heart out with every note. Peter Guralnick, a famous writer, said it was one of the best examples of Elvis's unique style. He was right. The song was haunting and emotional. I'll Be There was a pretty pop song originally by Bobby Darin. Darin's version was a bit forced, but Elvis made it sound natural and flowing. Even though he didn't know all the words, he made the song his own and really brought it to life. The highlight of the session was Suspicious Minds. This song about a broken relationship was a hit right from the start. The bridge where the tempo drops in half was a bit gimmicky, but it made the song instantly memorable. It was both artistic and commercial, and it became one of Elvis's most beloved tracks. When the February session started, it felt like a continuation of the January recordings. The same people were there, and Elvis was in good spirits. They started with a jam session, and then got to work. True Love Travels on a Gravel Road was a country song, but Elvis added a soulful touch and a driving rhythm. It was a great mix of styles. Stranger in My Own Hometown was a transformation of Percy Mayfield's 1963 song. Elvis doubled the length and repeated the same verses, but each time he added something new. It was like a mini concert in the studio, and you could tell everyone was having a blast. It was a great example of Elvis's blues skills. Grass Won't Pay No Mind by Neil Diamond was a different kind of song. Elvis gave it a gentle, delicate performance, and the female backing vocals and strings added a sweet touch. It was a beautiful track, even if the production was a bit sugary. Power of My Love was an edgy rock song in waltz time. Elvis gave a dramatic, almost threatening performance, which was surprising coming from a song by the same writers who gave us Devil in Disguise. It was one of the best songs of the session. After Loving You was a country song that Elvis sang with a strong, emotional vocal. He repeated the last lines over and over, just like Della Reese did in her version. It was another example of Elvis's storytelling skills. Do You Know Who I Am was a quiet, understated ballad. The lyrics were like a sequel to Just Tell Her Jim Said Hello. It was a great showcase for Elvis's acting abilities, and he delivered a convincing performance. Kentucky Rain was a dramatic song with a strong story. It was the last single from the Memphis sessions, but it didn't do as well as the others. It only reached #16 in the US and #21 in the UK, which was surprising because it was such a strong song. Elvis's performance was totally compelling, and it had a mix of different genres that made it stand out. Only the Strong Survive was a soul cover of Jerry Butler's hit. Elvis put in a strong performance, but it was very similar to Butler's original. It took a lot of takes to get it right, but the arrangement didn't change much. It Keeps Right on a Hurtin', and If I'm a Fool for Loving You were country songs with a nice, easygoing feel. They weren't as standout as some of the other tracks, but they were still good performances. Any Day Now had a tricky melody, but Elvis handled it with ease. The song had a soulful touch and a bit of Tom Jones influence. On the last night, they recorded The Fair Is Moving On and Who Am I? The Fair Is Moving On had a big belting chorus, and Who Am I? Was a nice, understated religious song. They were pleasant, but not as memorable as the rest of the material. The songs from these sessions were spread over 2 albums, From Elvis in Memphis and Back in Memphis. From Elvis in Memphis was hailed as Elvis's greatest album, but not everyone agreed. Some critics loved it, while others found the balance poor or the material weak. Back in Memphis got better reviews because of the live performances, but the studio tracks were still mixed. Some people thought the studio recordings were great, while others found them disappointing. In the end, these sessions showed Elvis at his best, but also highlighted some of his weaknesses. It was a roller coaster of emotions and styles, but it was all part of what made Elvis so unique and beloved. I remember the first 2 months of 1969 like it was yesterday. I was in the studio trying to make a comeback. I didn't know it at the time, but the recordings I made would later be considered some of my best work. But when I first released them, the critics didn't seem to notice. They were more excited about my live shows later that year, where I mostly played my old hits. It was like they wanted to live in the past, where I was just starting out. One of the critics, Peter Guralnick, wrote a lot about my new album, From Elvis in Memphis. He said it was great, but he couldn't help but miss the innocence of my early days at Sun Records. He said things like, "You can't recapture the innocent ease of those first sides. I get it. My early recordings were special, but so was this new stuff." Guralnick and others seemed to be nostalgic for their own youth, not just mine. They couldn't see that I was growing too, and that's okay. But it was frustrating to know that no matter how good I was, it would never be good enough for some people. Even though the reviews weren't always great, the Memphis sessions gave me 3 top 10 singles. I was back on the charts and on TV. The next step was to get back on stage. So in March 1969, I worked on my last movie, Change of Habit. It was supposed to be more relevant to the late 60s, but it felt a bit too naive. The songs were okay, but they didn't compare to what I'd been doing in Memphis. The title track, Change of Habit, was a decent rock number, and I felt like it fit with where I was in my career. Let Us Pray was a bit too religious for some, and Have a Happy was sappy, but Let's Be Friends was a standout. It was a sweet, tender song that could have been on one of my Memphis albums. After the movie, I was done with films. I was ready to get back to live performances. On July 31st, 1969, I walked onto the stage at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. It was my first live show in 8 years. The crowd was amazing, and the reviews were even better. Billboard said I was a polished, confident, and talented artist. I was different from the Elvis of the 1950s, but I still knew how to rock. I opened with Blue Suede Shoes, and the energy was electric. I followed it with Johnny B. Good and All Shook Up. I even did a serious version of Are You Lonesome Tonight, with Millie Kirkham's beautiful backing vocals. I introduced Hound Dog as my message song, and even though it wasn't as rebellious as it used to be, I gave it my all. I also did I Can't Stop Loving You, which became a showstopper with its powerful arrangement. I played My Babe and a medley of Mystery Train and Tiger Man, which were absolute highlights. The live album, In Person at the International Hotel, captured the energy of those shows. It wasn't perfect, there were moments of silence and some jokes that didn't translate well on record, but it was a success. I was back, and this time I was here to stay. Elvis's second season in Vegas in 1970 was a big deal. The live album from this time, called On Stage February 1970, was different from the first one. It had 10 songs, and all of them were covers of hits from the past 10 years. 8 of the songs were recorded in February 1970, and 2 were from the previous season. The album starts with C.C. Rider. This song would become Elvis's standard opener for his concerts in the coming years. In 1970, though, it wasn't the opener but was placed early on the album. Elvis turned this old blues song into a rocking number. He based the arrangement on a 1962 version by Laverne Baker. The song would get more grand over the years, but this early version is crisp and clean, and it's the best of all the recordings Elvis made of it. Release Me is a country favorite that Elvis tried to make his own. He gave it a faster tempo and a bluesy feel, but it didn't quite work. Elvis changed the melody, which didn't sound natural, and he repeated the first verse over and over, making the song repetitive. Still, I think it's good that Elvis tried to do something different with it. Sweet Caroline is a cover of Neil Diamond's hit. Elvis's version is straightforward, and he sings it well. The arrangement was updated a bit for the August 1970 shows, and that version works better. It's a nice song, but Elvis doesn't bring anything new to it. It's easy to see why he liked it, and why it was popular in Vegas. The Wonder of You is the song that really marked the start of the 1970s Elvis. It has a big, dramatic arrangement, and Elvis's powerful vocals. The lyrics are very sentimental, and the melody is memorable. This song became a huge international hit, and is one of the most famous Elvis recordings from the 1970s. People love to request it on the radio for their loved ones. Elvis sings it really well, and that's probably why it's so popular. Elvis's second Vegas season showed that he was still on top of his game. But there were signs that things were starting to change. The songs he chose, and the way he performed them, were different from his earlier rock and roll days. Some fans didn't like this change, and they wondered if their favorite rocker was becoming a crooner. But for now, Elvis was still the king, and his shows were still a big hit. Elvis really missed out on the last part of a song, which made it feel like it could mean anything. It could be about a lover, a friend, a parent, or even God. It wasn't as deep as some of his other songs from Memphis. Instead, it was more like something you'd sing at karaoke. But that didn't stop it from defining Elvis's career for the next 7 years. During this time, Elvis took songs and turned them into big, dramatic performances. He did this with Suspicious Minds and Polk Salad Annie. Tony Joe White's version of Polk Salad Annie was really charming, but Elvis made it more about his stage presence and the big sound. Over time, the song got even more over the top, but in 1970, it was still a great piece of showmanship. Elvis also recorded Proud Mary, but the arrangement wasn't as smooth as it would be later. He mixed different styles like rock and gospel, which became a theme in his music. Walk a Mile in My Shoes was a perfect fit for Elvis. He blended country and gospel, giving it a spiritual feel. But he only performed it for a short time before dropping it from his shows. Let It Be Me was another song that Elvis only used for this season. It had a gospel feel, but it wasn't as powerful as some of the other songs on the album. Critics were confused by Elvis's new style. Some said the arrangements were too overdone, like a Las Vegas show. But Elvis loved the drama and theatrics, even if some critics didn't. Albert Goldman, a critic some Elvis fans don't like, said Elvis's shows were smooth but a bit too theatrical. He compared Elvis's poses to ancient statues, but not all critics were negative. Some, like Jack Lloyd, thought Elvis was closer to his roots and really connected with the audience. Lou Harris from the Chicago Tribune said Elvis was singing well, and not just reviving old hits. After the shows, more recordings from this period came out. They showed a different side of Elvis, someone who was having fun and changing lyrics on the fly. He seemed more interested in having a good time than giving perfect performances. This was a bit frustrating, but it also showed a casual side of Elvis. Elvis then performed at the Houston Astrodome, but it didn't go as well as hoped. He had a cold and the setup wasn't perfect, but he still broke attendance records. Plans for a live TV special didn't happen, but Elvis signed a deal for a concert documentary called That's the Way It Is. In June 1970, Elvis recorded in Nashville. His voice had changed, becoming richer and more powerful. He recorded 20 Days and 20 Nights, a ballad that showed his new vocal style. I've Lost You was a big ballad that became a template for many of his future songs. He also recorded I Was Born About 10,000 Years Ago, a gospel song that showed his joy in music making. The Sound of Your Cry was another big ballad, but Elvis overdid it a bit. He also recorded Faded Love and The Fool, a song he had recorded privately years ago. These sessions showed Elvis's ability to mix different styles and his love for music, even if not every song was a hit. After the first night, I felt like I was really getting into the swing of things. The next day, we tackled some bluegrass tunes. Little Cabin on the Hill was a neat little song that I released while I was still recording. The other one, 100 Years From Now, was a bit more relaxed and a little less polished, but that's part of what makes it so charming. We didn't get around to releasing it until the 1990s. Both songs weren't the best I've ever recorded, but it was great to just sit back and sing something I loved without all the pressure. We ended the night with a fun, upbeat version of Cindy, Cindy. It was a simple song, but it made us all laugh and relax after a long day of recording. I attacked the verses with a bit of a mean edge, but it was all in good fun. By the end of the night, we had 7 songs in the can. The next night, we started off with Bridge Over Troubled Water. I wanted to give it a powerful, show-stopping vibe, starting out soft and then building up to this big gospel-like finish. It was a lot different from the Simon and Garfunkel version, but I think it worked. The record company even added applause to the end to make it sound like a live performance. It was a bit strange, but it was a common thing back then. I couldn't resist jumping into a jam session with Got My Mojo Working and Keep Your Hands Off of It. We didn't plan it, but the tapes were rolling, and it turned out to be one of the best moments of the whole session. It was just me and the band having a blast. Later, they added some overdubs to make it sound more polished, but the raw energy was already there. How the Web Was Woven was a song I really liked. I slowed it down a bit and turned it into a big ballad. The metaphor of the web and the fly wasn't the most romantic, but I think it worked. The song was one of the highlights of the session, and I was proud of it. It's Your Baby, You Rock It was a country song with a bit of a twist. The lyrics were about giving advice that wasn't taken, and it ended up hurting someone. It wasn't a classic, but it was fun to sing, and it would have made a good single. Stranger in the Crowd had a bit of a Latin flavor, which was different for me. It was about the joy of love, which was a nice change from all the sad songs. I think it worked well on stage, even though it didn't become a regular part of my shows. The next night we recorded 6 more songs, but they weren't as exciting. It Ain't No Big Thing, But It's Growing was a pleasant country song, but it wasn't anything special. You Don't Have to Say You Love Me was a hit, but it was a bit too bombastic. I think I was just showing off my voice a bit too much. Just Pretend was a dramatic song that built up to a thrilling climax. The gospel tones and the piano work by David Briggs made it stand out. It became a fan favorite, even though it wasn't a single. The last few songs of the night were a bit of a letdown. This Is Our Dance was a bland waltz, and Heart of Rome was too high for me to sing comfortably. Life was one of the strangest songs I ever recorded. It tried to mix Genesis and Darwin, but it was just plain weird. The production was good, but the song itself was a bit of a mess. The next night we started with When I'm Over You, which wasn't a bad song, but it wasn't great either. The best part was when I started thinking about a country album. I had already recorded a few country songs, and I really enjoyed I Really Don't Want to Know. I gave it a bluesy feel, and it was a perfect fit for my new, richer voice. It didn't do as well as a single as I hoped, but I was proud of it. Then we did Faded Love, which I had played around with earlier. This time we made it more rock than country, and it was a lot of fun. We edited it for the album, but the full version is amazing. Tomorrow Never Comes was a ballad that I turned into a tour de force. The arrangement was inspired by Roy Orbison and Shirley Bassey, and it built up to this incredible climax. It would have been great on stage, but I never got around to performing it. Make the World Go Away was a bit of a letdown. It was a good song, but it didn't have the same energy as the others. It was a bit boring, to be honest. Funny How Time Slips Away was a Willie Nelson song that I really connected with. I sang it in a relaxed, laid-back way, and it was one of the best recordings of the session. I wish I had recorded more of Willie's songs. I Washed My Hands in Muddy Water was another fun one. I sang the chorus over and over, and we all had a great time. The full version is a lot better than the edited one that made it onto the album. We also did 2 non-country songs. The Next Step Is Love was a pop song about a friendship turning into something more. It had a Beatles-like feel, and it was one of my more contemporary-sounding recordings. Finally, we did a new version of Love Letters, which I had recorded a few years earlier. It wasn't as good as the original, and I was a bit tired by the end of the night. But overall, it was a great session, and I was really happy with what we had accomplished. The final night of the recording sessions was a bit of a letdown. Elvis and the musicians were tired, and we didn't have great songs to work with. The first song, There Goes My Everything, was a country tune, but it didn't stand out. The arrangement was simple, and even though Elvis sang well, it just didn't have that special something. Next, we tried If I Were You. The lyrics were a bit much, with lines like, "If I were you, I know that I'd love me." It was hard to feel sorry for the guy singing the song, because it sounded a bit conceited. But it was still better than some of the songs from Elvis's movies, which were often pretty bad. Then we did Only Believe, a gospel song. Elvis didn't seem very into it, and the song itself was pretty bland. He did try it out once in Vegas, but it never really caught on. Sylvia was a big ballad, and Elvis seemed to enjoy it more, especially the chorus. But it wasn't one of the best songs from the session. There were others that were more memorable. The last song we recorded was Patch It Up, a rock number. Elvis and the band put a lot of energy into it, but it didn't quite work. It was a bit manic, and even though they tried hard, it didn't become a showstopper. It only lasted 2 performances on stage before they dropped it. Over the 5 nights, we recorded more than 30 songs. Some were released as singles, but they didn't do as well as the songs from the Memphis sessions the year before. We put out 3 albums, including That's the Way It Is, which was tied to the concert documentary. The album had a mix of studio and live recordings, and it was well received by some, but not by everyone. Richard Meltzer, a critic from Rolling Stone, really didn't like it. He was upset that Elvis was moving away from rock and roll and into more middle-of-the-road music. He wrote some harsh stuff, but looking back, the album is now considered one of Elvis's best. It's seen as a mature collection of songs that really showed Elvis's growth as an artist. Elvis's next project was a concert movie called That's the Way It Is. We did a lot of rehearsals, and Elvis was all over the place. Sometimes he was serious and in control, directing everyone, and other times he was just having fun, singing random songs. One of the best moments was when he was working on the arrangement for I Just Can't Help Believin'. He was really focused and knew exactly what he wanted. RCA recorded the first 6 concerts of Elvis's 3rd Las Vegas season. They only released 4 tracks, but they were really good. I've Lost You was a strong performance, but the live version wasn't as tender as the studio take. I Just Can't Help Believin' was a standout with a subtle arrangement that built to a thrilling climax. Elvis and his backup singers really shone. Patch It Up was more of a rock song, but it didn't quite take off on stage. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' was another highlight. The arrangement was dramatic, and Elvis really owned the stage. It was a great mix of music and theater. The live recordings and the movie captured a lot of what made Elvis special. Even though some critics didn't like the direction he was taking, the fans and many others recognized the quality of his work. As the year 1971 began, things were a bit rocky for me. There was a paternity suit that had everyone talking, and I even mentioned it during a concert in Los Angeles. It was a tough time, and I tried to brush it off, but it was clear it was weighing on me. Then, just a few weeks later, the news hit that I had received some death threats. The idea of performing in Las Vegas with extra security was both unsettling and surreal. When I hit the stage in Vegas on January 26th, it felt different. The energy wasn't the same, and the shows were noticeably shorter, some barely lasted 40 minutes. The audience recordings from that time barely captured the magic. I stuck to the same songs I had been doing, but it was hard to find the spark. I tried to get into it with ballads like Something or There Goes My Everything, but it was hit or miss. There were a few new songs like Only Believe and Snowbird, but even those felt a bit off. As the season went on, I started to find my footing again. The shows got longer, and I felt more connected to the music. By the end of the season, I was back to giving it my all. But it was clear that the year was going to be a mix of ups and downs. In March, I hit the studio again. I was a bit late, and it was clear I wasn't in the best headspace. We recorded a cover of Anne Murray's Snowbird, which was nice but not exactly a standout. Then we tackled Where Did They Go, Lord?, which turned out to be a bit of a roller coaster. I put a lot of raw emotion into it, almost like I was letting out some pent-up frustration. The other side of the single, Rags to Riches, was even more intense. I was really belting it out, and the arrangement was big and bombastic. It was a bit over the top, but it had a certain power to it. We also did a wild, driving version of Jerry Lee Lewis's Whole Lotta Shackin' Going On. It was like a different song altogether, with a hypnotic drum beat that pushed me to the edge. I even got a bit manic, grunting and groaning through the verses. It was a release, and it showed just how much I was feeling things. Despite the ups and downs, the music always seemed to bring me back. Whether it was the bombast of the studio sessions or the highs and lows of the live performances, I knew that as long as I had the music, I could find my way through the rough patches. The year might have been a mix of good and bad, but it was all part of the journey. And no matter what, the music always kept me going.